Today, as we said last time, we do appreciate how busy everybody is, so these sessions are designed to be short and focus on specific risk factor topics. Last time we covered the risk score, and today we're focusing on how you can use the system to hopefully help you spot a fraud. Hopefully, following our previous masterclass, most of you on the session will already know us, but by the way of introduction, we're the account management team here at EQ Risk Factor. I'm Andrea Tanner, Head of Customer Success. I lead the account management team and also look after a number of our key customers. I've been in the industry many years, having previously worked at Clydesdale Yorkshire Bank as a client manager and then also heading up the client management team there. I'm joined today by two of our account directors, Richard Pride and Dan Smith, and I'll just hand over to them for them to quickly introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, my name is Richard Pride, account director here over at EQ Risk Factor. I've been working here for about 2 years. Prior to that, worked for 7 years at RBS Invoice Finance, BB Financial Services, doing various roles including relationship manager and auditor. And over to Dan.
Thanks, Richard. Hi, I'm Dan. Been in the commercial finance space for around 16 years and at Risk Factor for the last 2 years. Previously been at RBS Invoice Finance, much like Richard, and Ultimate Finance in client manager roles.
Thank you both. So in our latest Outlook report, which surveys finance professionals in the UK, America and Europe, we found that lenders are really concerned that fraud has risen since the start of the pandemic. And I guess that's no surprise. Not only are we still feeling the impacts of COVID, we're dealing with higher rates of inflation, rising energy bills, the impacts of Brexit, and of course the current situation in the Ukraine. All of these have created a perfect storm of issues facing businesses. So it's likely that businesses will come under additional pressure, and we all know how easy it could be to add an additional invoice to raise funds to pay wages, and we also know how quickly that can run away with itself and become the vicious circle of fraud that emerges. So it's more important than ever to be alert to fraud, but we know that spotting fraud can be really, really difficult. Obviously, the risk factor system can't stop this from happening, but we can help you become aware of it much more quickly so that you can take action. So the areas we're going to cover today are the key features of fraud, the benefits of the cash versus sales chart, the importance of the cash forecast report and how to use it, and finally we'll look at some portfolios which we recommend using to potentially help you to stop fraud. So for some of you more experienced users, as last time, hopefully this session will be a good refresher, or if you're relatively new to the system, hopefully you'll pick up something new. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the key features of fraud. As with the last masterclass, everybody will remain on mute during the session. The session is being recorded and we will share the slides with everybody afterwards. So I will just hand over to Richard for him to chat through the key features of fraud.
Thanks, Andrea. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a scenario whereby you are looking for a client that might be committing fraud in the first place. So you don't necessarily know who they are yet, but we're going to try and spot them. Now, the way we're going to do this is we're going to log in on Risk Factor from the dashboard. Now, I've created a portfolio for the purpose of this masterclass, which quite simply just lists a client. However, in the real world, you'd probably click on a portfolio that might be generated by the system, and that's something that Dan will cover off in a little bit later. So I've gone to the portfolio that I need to. I found the client that I want to look at. Now, first of all, I need to make sure that I've got the relevant grid in place. Now, I've created a grid, which I've called indicators of fraud. And this grid we will be sharing with you as part of the pack that follows this presentation. Now, this grid has been created based on feedback from some of our clients where they've had frauds and the key things that they've spotted. What this grid is it's relatively simple to use as well. So it uses key metrics, things like sales, cash and dilutions, rather than using things like the risk score and some of the other more complicated measures. So once you can help spot the fraud using this grid, you then might want to look at other metrics, but this is certainly a good starting point. So the next thing I'm going to do is just change the period. At the moment, we're on the today view, which means you're seeing the most recent position of all the data. We would recommend that you use a monthly view, simply because quarterly doesn't tend to give enough detail and weekly or daily can give sometimes a bit too much detail to spot some trends. So for the purpose of today, I'm just going to do the monthly average, but you can, of course, do the end of period. Now, just to walk through the grid then. So we're going to start off, first of all, by looking at sales. Sales are usually one of the first things that indicate a fraud, purely because for clients to be able to draw down fictitious funding, they need to put through fictitious invoices in the first place, or indeed ones that aren't quite true. Now we can see with this particular client towards the beginning of the period, we've had a large increase in sales and Risk Factor is flagging it as red. If you remember, the sales movement takes the average of sales of the 30 days and compares that to sales of the previous 90 days. What we've also done is included the actual monetary value of the invoices going through. This can be useful just to see exactly what those figures are and can help to make it quite real rather than just a percentage. Similar to this, we're now going to look at cash. Now, in the ideal world, when sales go on, cash should follow, and it should indeed follow a very similar pattern. So an increase in sales here should see an increase of cash following. However, we've not seen that in this example. If anything, we've seen the opposite. We've seen cash reducing. And you can see again, Riskfactor has flagged that here. I've also put the monetary value of the cash, just in case, again, you did want to get a good comparison just to see how the two are working along each other. Now, the DSO is obviously a very important measure. You'll remember from the last masterclass that the DSO target is the thing that influences the color, whether it goes blue or red. Now, we can see that, let's assume that this is correct, that this DSO is breaching its target, and indeed towards the end it's getting a lot worse. What we've also included here is the DSO movement measure. And a bit like the sales and cash movement, what this does is it takes the current DSO and compares it to the 90-day average. Therefore, it does show if there's been any changes. And just a quick reminder, the clock simply means that it doesn't have enough data to give an accurate reading. Next to this, we have the dilutions. Now, where I said in an ideal world, cash should follow sales, unfortunately, in the real world where there is a fraud, usually it's dilutions that eventually do follow suit. And you can see that that happens towards the end of this period here. So we can see the net dilution for the period. Now, in this case, it is monthly. The period for the 30-day, the 90-day, and of course, the total again, the actual monetary value of those dilutions, just for help of comparison. What we've done next to all those then is then put the commitments. So the commitments is the borrowing of a client. So we can see here that we've got the commitment percentage of the gross sales ledger, the net sales ledger, and the facility limit. This helps to just give an indication of how hungry the client is for cash. And so next to that, we've also put the cash desperation percentage, which does show that as a percentage of cash desperation. Finally, we've put the monetary value of the commitment and the facility limit. And this just shows how the client's borrowing against that facility limit in terms of monetary value. And we can see in this particular client's case that over time, over the year period, it's been increasing. And you can see in this example, it's because the lender has been allowing the client to withdraw more by increasing that limit. Finally, as a bit of a bonus, we've also included the schedule indicator. Now you'll notice that when we're looking at a period view, we can't actually see the schedule. So I'm very quickly just going to change back to the today view just so you can see that. Now the schedule view, for those that use it, will know that it's a good way to log information that's being received into Riskfactor. This, alongside that information that I've just gone through, can help to paint a bigger picture. So, for example, with this particular client, if you remember, cash was very low at the very beginning of the period. And at that point, chances are that cash was being direct banked, for example. If we compare that with the fact that, well, they've bothered to send over the CIS certificate, but they haven't their bank statements, chances are they're probably trying to hide something. So it's always useful just to compare how the information is going against the actual information you're seeing on the system. Now, I'm very quickly just going to go back over to the average view. And before I pass over to Andrea, I'm just going to show you a quick way that you can put this information into a more visual form. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight sales, cash, and dilutions. That's the monetary values. I'm going to go over to charts at the top here and click on the custom selection button. And what that's going to do is put that information into a nice, easy to view graph. And what this does, hopefully, for those that perhaps work more visually, or indeed anyone, it does very quickly show the key trends. And you can see, as we saw earlier, cash didn't come in here. It did eventually recover a little bit here. But if you look towards the right, you can see the direct correlation between a high amount of sales and the dilutions that follow. So as you can see, in a few seconds, that graph really does show you where the fraud could be. I'll just pass over to Andrea.
That's great, Richard. Thank you. So, as Richard has explained, one of the key indicators of a fraud is a shortfall in cash. Now, there may be legitimate reasons for this, but this is an area which we would always is recommended that you investigate thoroughly. So, one of the easiest ways to review the cash performance is to use the cash surplus shortfall measure. So, if Richard just changes our grid to the cash analysis grid, so if you just go on the blue banner on the top, Richard, and select cash analysis, please. And we recommend using the cash analysis grid with these particular measures. And as we've said, we will be sharing this with you afterwards. So this grid is quite concise in the information that it has. So if we just go across to the cash surplus shortfall on the right hand side here. So what we can see here is the amount of cash that is required to be collected. So this particular client has a target DSO of 50 and their actual DSO is 116. So Riskfactor is telling us that 117,000 needs to be collected in order to achieve the target DSO of 50. Now, as Richard explained before, an easier way of viewing this is to do the cash versus sales chart. Now, this is a preset chart in your system. So if Richard just goes to the blue banner across the top and selects the cash versus sales chart, what you would hope to see where cash is being received as expected is a tight correlation between these two lines. Where a gap emerges, where there's a divergence, the jaws of death as we tend to call it, you will see that the cash isn't being received as expected. Now, when I was using Riskfactor, this is always one of the key places that I would go to. So for any clients, if I wanted to get a quick feel of how things were performing and if there were any issues, this would be my go-to charts. So if you do identify that there have been a shortfall in cash collections, what we would then recommend doing is using the cash forecast report. So if Richard just closes down the chart on the screen, and if we go to our reports section, you will see that you will have the cash forecast, and this is the second report option there. So if we just take a look at this in a little bit more detail, if we just start with the top left, you will see that we have the actual DSO of 118 days versus the target of 50. And if we just move down, you will see that the actual balance, now that's the sales ledger balance. Now, if the target DSO of 50 was being met, then we should be achieving the theoretical balance of 87,000. So you can see here that we do have this shortfall of 118,000. And if we just go down to the bottom of the chart here, you will see that we have the actual collections versus the required collections. So in this particular example, we can see that the client has only collected £20,000 in the last 30 days. However, if they were to achieve the DSO target of 50, in the next 14 days, they would need to collect 141,000. So what you need to be asking yourself, is that realistic? So what we would recommend doing is using this report with your clients alongside their sales ledger. So can the client identify where this 141,000 is going to come from? Do they know which debtors are going to pay it? And it may be then that you would decide to do a debt verification exercise to confirm that the balances are accurate and also to see if you can obtain a payment date. If as part of this exercise you determine that the actual DSO is incorrect, you can then remodel the report. So rather than going into the system and actually overriding the DSO, what you can do here is if we select the proposed drop-down target there, please, Richard, and if we change this to 70 days, for example. So what you will see now is everything that's been recalculated. The theoretical balance has been adjusted and the required collections over the next 30 days have also been recalculated. So as we say, we do recommend that this is a really good report to use with your clients alongside their sales ledger, but we often find from people that this is an underutilised part of the system. So as we move into our next session now, I'm just going to hand over to Dan for him to chat through some portfolios which we would recommend using to proactively identify fraud.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, some of you will have all of these portfolios already in your systems. Others may not. And if anyone is missing any of these, when we share these slides, all the criteria that is used to make up each of the portfolios are on the slides, and you'll be able to replicate them in your system. Of course, if anyone needs any support in setting these up, please just reach out to us, and we'll be more than happy to help get them replicated in your Riskfactor. So as you know, portfolios within Riskfactor are a group of clients that are brought together by setting certain criteria. This criteria can be any of the measures that are available within Riskfactor, and then these are overlaid with the grid of choice to see the specific areas you want to review. The setting of the portfolio criteria is always important. The ors and the ands can get quite confusing at times. However, these particular portfolios we recommend are really very simple, and we wouldn't recommend overcomplicating them. The more criteria you add, the more there is that can go wrong. So these portfolios can all be really useful. And I know that for myself as a user, I used to come in and look at my own portfolio of clients, filter by risk score, and see what was changing. I rarely went into the whole range of portfolios and certainly wouldn't have been able to confidently speak about what was making up each of those portfolios. I hope by walking through these that it will give you the confidence to look at some of the other areas of your clients and start to delve a little deeper into some of the stats that Riskfactor's showing you. Riskfactor is such a powerful tool, but you need to be getting into these different areas to really get the full benefit and understanding of the client activity. So we'll move on to our first recommended portfolio. So this portfolio is the fast DSO, and this is made up of cash turn, 30-day alert or caution, a commitment of over 20,000, and a target DSO of less than 40. And this portfolio has a couple of scenarios where it becomes really helpful. This is where you either have a new client that's been on the books for less than 35 days, or a client who has a really quick turnaround in their DSO or a fast DSO. When you've got a newly taken on client, it can take a while for the DSO to reach a meaningful number, typically say up to 60 days. However, because the cash term measure is based upon a much shorter period of time, once a client has been with you for about 3 weeks, the cash term becomes meaningful. So this portfolio will indicate where the collections haven't been very strong since take on. This is an area of risk that is obviously very important to lenders and is a portfolio that could potentially assist in picking up an issue really early on and stopping something running away with itself and becoming a much larger risk of loss later down the line. An example where this portfolio really comes into its own is if you've got a client selling fresh food where you would expect the DSO to be between 20 and 30 days. If that client starts to bank your cash, the DSO measure will take several weeks before it raises an alarm, yet the cash term measure will highlight the situation very quickly. Next up, we've got the teaming and lading portfolio. So this looks at commitment of over 500,000, the DSO value not alarmed, and sales movement percentage over 30%. What I would say with all of these portfolios, it is worth just bearing in mind that we've set these criteria based on sort of industry averages. You may want to look at these slightly differently in terms of the commitment levels and things based on the averages in your particular in your particular books. So this portfolio is very much about spotting something that's too good to be true. This is where it looks like you've got a growing client with cash being repaid quickly, but the reality is very different. Teaming and lading is a bookkeeping fraud, also known as short banking, delayed accounting, and lapping, and it involves the allocation of one customer's payments to another customer's accounts to make the books balance, and it's often used to hide a shortfall or a theft. Most often, teaming and lading is a strategy used by clients who have used a customer's money for other purposes other than repaying the invoice finance company to cover their tracks. It may also be used by a client that's used one customer's money for another customer's benefit. And in both of these examples, teaming and lading helps keep the activity from being found out, and that's by delaying the deficit from showing up in the ledger and manipulating the company accounts. This is a really common fraud which can be difficult to detect and can easily lead to high levels of write-off. The client's standard risk score improves over time and can lead the client manager into thinking they're funding a well-managed growing client. We'll now move on to what we call ones to watch. This portfolio looks at cash desperation, DSO alarming, and sales movement percentage. We've seen a large number of fraud cases over the last couple of years where these three events all coincide. This portfolio once again relies on the target DSO being set correctly, and I'm sure you can see the theme appearing here across our masterclasses that the target DSO really is key. The portfolio shows where you're seeing high growth. However, the client is also very cash hungry and is drawing every last penny against every new invoice they submit. So despite the fact that these clients look like they're growing and are buoyant with the DSO being at alarms, this indicates to us that the client is unable to obtain timely payments for the new invoices. Now, of course, this could be a fraud indicator, but let's also remember that Riskfactor is presenting to you the stats based on the criteria set. It doesn't have the ability to define for you exactly what's going on. With this criteria, it might also be that the client is genuinely going through a high growth period, but doesn't have the people in place to support this growth. I've used this portfolio in the past myself to promote a move to factoring for a period so that the lender can manage collections and take greater control, or engage a conversation with the client to seek some further support in the business. Of course, growth is great news for the client, but if they aren't collecting the cash to go alongside it, they will soon fall into trouble and there's a risk to the lender. So our next two portfolios you may have seen if you've used our due diligence model. And this is our audit and survey tool. But if you've not used that, these may be new ones to you. And again, all the criteria is on the slides here. So the first one here is the erratic trading portfolio. And this is used to identify where a client has had no cash for 14 days, a negative sales movement, and a DSO movement of more than 15. The portfolio is looking at where things come out of trend and aren't running as expected. This may be something that triggers you to complete an audit or some data verification. The sales going backwards, cash not coming in for 14 days, and overall cash taking longer to arrive to repay the debt, resulting in the DSO movement. And finally, we'll look at the fresh air portfolio. So this portfolio looks at clients where cash isn't coming through very quickly, with a measure of no cash for 14 days, cash versus sales of less than 65%, alongside high dilutions above 10% and sales movement greater than 50. These criteria should help in picking out potential cases of fresh air invoicing, and this is one of the most common types of fraud and the one we see most of. Things start to become a vicious circle for clients who perhaps put through one fresh air invoice to help with wages or a one-off payment in 1 week, but it becomes very difficult to get out of and creates issues that become larger by the week for the lender. So I'm just going to hand over back to Richard now for the summary.
Perfect. Thanks, Dan. So just to do a recap of the things that we've just covered there, and also just to add a few other pointers which might help you when you're looking to diagnose a fraud. Now, first of all, just at the beginning, just to recap what we looked at. So the key trends for a fraud, and it is the key ones, it's not always the case, is the increase in sales. Usually that's followed by an increase in borrowing on those sales. When that cash doesn't come in because it's not real, we see an increase in credit notes. And then, of course, we do see a decrease in cash as well. And remember, that can be for two reasons. It can be because the invoices don't exist, so there's no payment, or indeed it could be for genuine invoices where cash is being direct banked. Then we need to also take into account other factors when taking this into consideration. So when it comes to things such as audits or client visits, which are often requested when looking at the above, sometimes these can be cancelled or postponed at very last minute. Now, this immediately does tend to mean that something might not be right. Fair enough if it's a one-off, but when it becomes a pattern, then it's perhaps worth just probing and asking yourself as to why that's happening. Similar to this, sometimes clients will refuse to send over copy invoices or indeed other information that you ask them for. This again can show that they're trying to hide something. Also look at changes into the change of the month-end rec as to how that's being sent over. For many invoice discounting clients, the month-end rec is normally the one opportunity in a month where a lender has full visibility of a ledger. If all of a sudden that's coming in late, then ask yourself why that might be and really do make sure to press on it. Also, when looking at MI, it's sometimes really useful just to compare to see how invoices or sales in the MI match those that you're seeing in risk factor. For example, I've had previous cases where I've compared, fair enough, it was in the past, in that it wasn't live when it was happening. But if you look back in time, you can sometimes spot a fraud that happened and indeed perhaps resolved itself. But it's always really useful just to look at the MI and compare it to how actual sales are performing. And then finally, another factor to take into consideration is a change in relationship. And that can go both ways. Often it is a relationship that very quickly turns negative. That is to say they become more distant or they don't want to speak to you as much as they were previously. But sometimes it can be the opposite. We all have that one really hostile client that, they don't really like talking with you. All of a sudden, if they're trying to be your best friend, ask yourself the question, why is that? Chances are they might be trying to hide something and trying to win you over. If we could just go to the next slide, the next thing to do, similar on this theme, avoid making it easier for the clients to commit fraud. Now, I'll say it again, make sure that target DSO is correct and regularly reviewed and updated. The reason for this is it means Riskfactor is best enabled to help you spot that fraud in the first place. And similar to this, if you are going to increase it, or indeed if you're going to consider increasing the funding limit, make sure to do this alongside debt verification exercises just to ensure that it is genuine and it's not enabling the client to commit further fraud. So then just to give a summary of the key functionality within Riskfactor and how that can be used, almost like a timeline of spotting the fraud. So Dan covered over some excellent portfolios that are really useful for picking clients that could be possible contenders for frauds. I myself, when I was an RM, I was very guilty of having Richard Pride clients as a portfolio and using that normally just to spot trends. I didn't really make the full use of risk factor to sort those clients into risk-based portfolios and then go from there. So we'd always recommend using one of those portfolios to help as a starting point. Once you've done that, apply an applicable grid to it. Don't just use the client summary. Now, I used indicators of fraud earlier. That can be really good for spotting a fraud in the first place. But once you've then seen that fraud, it's worth looking at other measures. And Andrea covered the cash analysis grid. There's also the dilutions analysis grid as well, and many others that can be really useful just to hone in on specific parts of a sales ledger. Once we do that, make sure you set the correct period. You'll remember me saying monthly is definitely a good place to start. Quarterly doesn't really show good enough a trend. Weekly and daily can sometimes make it really too concentrated on a particular time period and can hide genuine trends. You'll just spot those micro trends that usually are quite normal. And then finally, whilst it is always good to see things in an Excel sheet that is risk factor or can be, sometimes it's very useful to put them into a graph as well, or as we call it, a chart. From here, you can then very quickly spot patterns, and there are indeed some preset ones, such as the cash versus sales, but you can also make your own ones just by doing the custom selection. And with that, I'll hand over to Andrea to close.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Dan, as well. So thank you, everybody, for your time today. As we said, these sessions are designed to be short and focused, and we know that spotting fraud can be really difficult, but hopefully you've found today useful either as a refresher or perhaps you've picked up something new which you can put into practice. If you have any questions, then please do feel free to get in touch with your account manager. We're happy to help. And would also love to hear your ideas for future sessions as well. We will be sharing the slides, which include the portfolio and the grid configuration. And as last time, we'll also be sending a short survey. So please, if you could just take a couple of minutes to complete that, we really do value your feedback, and it does help to shape these future sessions going forward. So thanks again, everybody, for your time today. Thank you.